Well, I really put you to work there, didn't I? Making you read not one, but three of this week's assigned scriptures. And I did so because, as you may have picked up, the stories all share very common themes. And maybe most notably, the stories each center around widows, these women whose husbands have died, which has made life for them especially difficult, usually resulting in poverty and situations of desperation. Well, in the first story, we read of Ruth and her mother-in-law, Naomi. The book of Ruth begins with a famine, and we soon learn that Naomi's husband has died, and 10 years later, so too do her sons, leaving her with these two daughter-in-laws who are both from foreign countries. And seeing that staying with Naomi is going to make life very difficult for them, certainly to marry again, she urges her daughters to return to their own country. The one agrees, but Ruth refuses. And in the section assigned to us this week, Ruth and Naomi have been taking or gleaning wheat from the fields of an older relative named Boaz. The Jewish law required that landowners were to leave the edge of their fields unharvested to allow the poor to go and pick and eat that bit of grain. And this is exactly what they've been doing. But more than picking wheat, Naomi has a plan to pick Boaz for her daughter. And in our passage, we read as Ruth does this likely very scandalous thing to make herself available to Boaz. And in the end, it all works out. Boaz and Ruth get married. They give birth to Obed, who would become the grandfather of the great King David himself, and eventually, as you work the lineage down, of Jesus himself. Well, in the second story, there is another famine. And this time, the great prophet of Israel, Elijah, requests that this widow, who has nothing of her own, provide for him some bread. And amazingly, she agrees. And in this story of this ancient Jewish miracle, the flour and the oil used to make the bread, they don't run dry. And Elijah eats, but so too does the widow of this story. And finally, in the third story, we meet Jesus. And at first we watch as he's angry again at these religious leaders, warning the disciples to watch out for these leaders who make a big show of themselves and their status and their place in the society. They walk around in their big flowing robes, and they want everyone to respect them. Meanwhile, they're stealing from their widows. And Jesus hates the hypocrisy of it all. But then, right as he sits down, he sees in the temple treasury where people are coming to give their offerings, he sees something that moves him. And he calls his disciples to come and take note of the scene. It's a widow, poor, nothing to live on, and yet from her poverty and in this great faith, she quietly gives all that she has. There's no pomp, there's no circumstance, just the quiet faith and sacrifice, and she gives. It's the opposite of the teachers that Jesus wants us to avoid, that he wants the disciples to avoid. And really what he does here is he sets this woman up as an example that we all should see and that we should follow. So we have three stories, three widows who all are living out this extraordinary faith. And what I want to do in the time that's remaining is just highlight a few of the things that stood out to me that I read in these passages. And then you can carry on the conversation, of course, on your own in your own church. First of all, the obvious things of these stories, as I've already highlighted, is that they all center around women. Women of great courage and women of great faith. And it's important to highlight that in an ancient culture that was so dominated by patriarchy, the Bible is actually filled with story after story after story of women of wisdom and valor and faith, and a faith that God blesses. And as I think about my own life, I'm reminded of the same in the women around me, my grandmothers, my mother, my mother-in-law, and of course, the many women in my church. And when the video is over, maybe one of the things you should do is just go around the room and give thanks to God for the women that are gathered with you and the women that are in your life. And as you do so, may you see these women as examples of faith, examples that the Bible also holds up and that the Bible blesses. Secondly, in the stories from the Old Testament, we watch as this great need of these women is met with great provision. The Lord provides with Naomi and Ruth by giving them Boaz, a kind and faithful man who first lets them glean from the field, and then later he marries Ruth and takes care of Ruth and Naomi. And then we read of the miraculous provision that cares for both Elijah and the widow. Now, I would suspect that some of you watching this, you also have great needs right now, or deep longings that you long to have answered. Maybe some of you are struggling with the very things that these stories speak to. You're struggling financially, or you're longing for companionship in the form of a spouse, someone in character, someone kind of like what we see in Boaz. Or it could be something altogether different. Whatever the case, whatever the need is, maybe after this video is finished, you can talk about this and pray for each other. And if your burden is something that you've never voiced before, maybe today is the day you need to be vulnerable. The Lord instructs us to be a people in the church that carry each other's burdens, but we can only carry that which we know. And so maybe today is the day that you need to be honest with your needs. Thirdly, each of the stories involve courage and faith and risk. In the first story, Ruth risks her reputation. As I said, the decision to lie at the feet of Boaz was very forward of her in that culture, and it could have backfired terribly. In the second two stories, the risk is more tangible. In both stories, the women agree to give the last of what they have, all that they have. But as they do so, it would seem, out of this great faith that they have in God. And here's the question that this asks of all of us. What is faith calling us to risk in this season of our life? Maybe there's something right now that you know that the Lord has been asking you to do. And I wonder how the faith of these women on this day might encourage you to step out and live out that sacrifice. And finally, let's look at Jesus. When you read through the New Testament, you quickly see that Jesus is constantly celebrating the powerless and the weak and the vulnerable. And it's so contrary to what we celebrate in our culture as we constantly are clamoring for the powerful and the beautiful. And when I say that, the sobering thing for me is that that's not just true of the culture, it's true of the church as well. In this Western commercialized church, it's around every corner where we're continuing to look for those who love to walk around in flowing robes or whatever the modern day equivalent of that is. But Jesus says to the church and he says to the disciples today, he gives us a warning, watch out. And in return, he sets up for us a widow with 2 pennies. These are the ones of faith that Jesus wants us to see and celebrate as examples. The weak and the powerless. This is who Jesus honors. And he does so because he knows that in the kingdom of God, everything is all topsy-turvy. It's all upside down. And it's the foolish things of the world, Jesus says, that God uses to shame the wise. And of course, the chief example of all of this is the cross. The cross, this emblem that sits at the center of our faith, is the reminder to a church and a world that's so fixed on power and success that God's economy and God's ways operates on a completely different plane. And so there's a warning here to us again today. Watch out. Do not be deceived, little church. Do not long for things in any other way. The way of the kingdom, the way of the church is not found in the power of flowing robes or of lavish displays of religious pomp and religious ceremony. The way of the kingdom is found in widows with 2 pennies who give all that they have in faith, and it's found in suffering servants who lay down their lives for the world that's around them, what we see in Jesus. And this is the example that Jesus has set before the church. And so with that, may the Lord bless you and keep you today as you talk together.